Rats. You said it was so spirited. I wanted to watch it. You have to tell us.
Yeah. Well, welcome to session 2 of our study of Ruth. I see Linda's on and the Falatars have joined us from Maine, which is great. I don't see Marilyn. I'm not sure if she's going to be joining us or not. Well, welcome everybody. What I'd like to do is, it's been a busy week, so I have not had a chance to prep as much as I normally like to. So I don't have as much to share up front, but I do want to share my screen and offer a couple introductory comments and a few reminders. Just to remind us that we are continuing with our sort of developing a definition of grace throughout this 12-week study, starting with the book of Jonah and then Paul's letter to the Philippians and now the book of Ruth. And really in the book of Ruth, looking at sort of this inversion, right? Those who maybe you wouldn't expect to be the recipients of grace are. Not because they're awful people like the Ninevites, but because of their ethnic background or other factors that may have disqualified them according to some. They're not disqualified according to God, right? And so they are recipients of grace. So we'll continue to sort of unpack that as we go through the rest of Ruth. I did want to offer a few comments related to last week's conversation because I went back and reread the first chapter, and we spent a good bit of time talking about verses 1 through 5, the prologue. We also talked a bit about some similarities between the book of Ruth and the book of Jonah. And when I reread it, I really saw the similarities in the sense that in the first chapter of Jonah, things go from bad to worse very quickly for Jonah. There's this intensification rapidly of his suffering and his need for mercy, his need for redemption. And in many ways, the same exact thing happens to Naomi, not because of her own disobedience, as was in the case of Jonah, but because of these circumstances that seem to just compound one after another. And a couple things that we didn't fully unpack last week that jumped out at me as I was reading again this past week. So I just want to review verses 1 through 5. This takes place in the time of Judges, which we know is a bad time, but as I thought about it over the course of the past week, the book of Judges also goes from bad to worse in terms of the Israelite response to Yahweh, their own faithfulness, their own obedience. At the beginning of the book, they are crying out for mercy, and God responds with mercy. By the end of Judges, it's kind of total depravity. They've just really fallen woefully short of the expectations that God had for them as they entered into the promised land. And that's the situation that Elimelech and Naomi and their family would have found themselves in. And then to compound things, there's a famine in the land. So not only is it a bad time for God's people in terms of their relationship with Yahweh, but now there's a famine. So then they go to Moab. And we didn't talk about this as much last week, but Moab, the Moabites were an arch enemy of the Israelites, but not in the same way that the Ninevites were, right? This foreign power. The Moabites had a common ancestor with the Israelites, and that would have been Lot. And if you go back to the book of Genesis, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot gets drunk. I'm not sure why that happens. The same thing happened to Noah. After he gets saved from the flood, he gets drunk, and the same thing happens to Lot. There's a pattern there. But for whatever reason, both of them get drunk. In Lot's case, his daughters seduce him, and one of them has sexual relations with their father. And out of that incestuous relationship is born a son who is the father of the Moabites. So, they could have gone other places, but they went to Moab. So again, it kind of goes from bad to worse, and then it continues to get worse. Elimelech dies. The sons marry Moabite women, and then they go 10 years without having children. which again, we didn't really talk about last week, but that would have been really problematic. We're not told that the women were barren, but clearly 10 years without offspring, without producing an heir, was significant. That really was unheard of in ancient times. And then, of course, the two husbands die. So similar to the way that Jonah went down, 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 and then ends up at the bottom of the sea, Naomi, beginning in the time of Judges, goes from bad to worse to worse to worse until finally she is bereft of her family, her means of support, and her own identity. So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I was really struck as I reread the book over the course of this last week, how intense that suffering was for Naomi. Last week, we finished chapter 1 by looking at sort of this first scene, Naomi returning to Bethlehem with Ruth. Today, we're going to look at chapter 2, scene 2, Ruth gleaning and meeting Boaz in the field, and the connection and relationship and dialogue between Ruth and Boaz, which is really remarkable. Next week, we'll look at Ruth asking Boaz to redeem and marry her. And then finally, we'll wrap things up with the actual marriage in chapter 4, the blessing of Naomi by the birth of grandchildren and the return of a family to Naomi, and then the genealogy, this extended blessing through the generations, resulting ultimately in the rise of David, the great king. So as we look at chapter 2, one of the things we noted in chapter 1 was the beautiful symmetry and how structured the chapter was. So it ends with the land being empty, Naomi being full, and then at the end of the chapter, Naomi being empty, losing everything, but the land being fruitful, moving from famine to harvest. In chapter 2, the framing is even more significant, I think, because at the end of chapter 1, the last words of the chapter are the beginning of the barley harvest. And according to the laws associated with Passover, the Passover couldn't begin until the beginning of the barley harvest, or the first fruits of the barley harvest were to be offered as part of the Passover celebration. So that's an indicator. If you were listening to this book being read aloud 3,000 years ago, people would have known what that meant, the beginning of the barley harvest. And then at the end of chapter 2, it's the end of the barley harvest and wheat harvest, that would have been the next crop to be harvested. And that was associated with the Feast of Pentecost, or the Festival of Weeks. And so the whole chapter is framed by these two great festivals, Passover and Pentecost, which again would not have been lost on the first hearers of this book. We read it today and we think, oh, there's a barley harvest and a wheat harvest, and we move on. But for the original hearers of the book, it would have been very clear the context in which this connection between Ruth and Boaz is taking place. And then finally, there are two really main themes in chapter 2, both associated with the role of Boaz. One of the roles that he seems to be fulfilling, or potentially going to fulfill, is the role of what's referred to as the kinsman redeemer. The word Gaal can mean nearest relative or redeemer. And so you put those together and you get kinsman redeemer. And it really comes from a tradition found in the book of Leviticus, where if a man was in debt, or if he died and left his widow in debt, that the closest kin would be obligated, not they had sort of right of refusal, but there was an obligation to pay off that debt and to buy back the family member from slavery, because the only other alternative would have been for the family member to work off that debt through labor, through enslavement. And so the Redeemer paid the debt and bought back the family member from slavery. Of course, if we fast forward to the New Testament, we clearly see ways in which early Christians picked up that image in reference to the work of Christ, that he paid off the debt of sin, bought us back from that enslavement, and of course the image of Jesus as brother in the New Testament. The other role that Boaz potentially is fulfilling here falls into the category of levirate marriage, and levirate comes from the Latin word for brother. And basically, it's another tradition in the Old Testament that says if a man dies, his brother would be obligated to marry that man's widow if there were no offspring. So if there were no male heirs, the brother would marry the widow in order to hopefully produce a male heir and continue the family line. Jesus picks up this tradition. You may recall he challenges the Sadducees, or the Sadducees, I should say, challenge Jesus and say, if a man dies and his brother marries the widow, and then that brother dies and the next brother marries, and there's 7 brothers, whose wife will she be in the afterlife, in the resurrection? So this was a tradition that was well known in the ancient world. We don't know exactly what the relationship was between Boaz and Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband. It's not clarified. He's not his brother, but he's a member of his clan. So it's not exactly levirate marriage, but the tradition would have been that if there was no brother, then the kind of closest male relative would fulfill that role, and so on. So there's a lot going on in this chapter, kind of behind the scenes, in terms of festivals and traditions that would have been well known to the ancient listener or reader of this book, but they are often lost on the contemporary reader because we obviously no longer live and live in that world and sort of breathe that cultural air, if you will. So those are some background things for chapter 2. It's probably more than I was planning to say. So any questions on sort of the background? There's so much going on in chapter 2 that we can unpack as we go through it. Any thoughts or questions on that? Okay, well, let's jump into chapter 2, and I'm just going to read the first verse. Remember, I've been asking us to read each chapter unto itself and pick up the themes and so forth. And if you're listening to the story and you don't know the rest of the story, at the end of chapter 1, it's a tragic story that ends on this hopeful note with Ruth coming back with Naomi, and there's kind of a new start and a fresh start for the two of them. But as the reader, you don't really have a sense of the possibility of redemption or rescue, if you will. But the first verse of chapter 2 changes all of that, because it says, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." So if you're listening to this 3,000 years ago, all of a sudden you're like, oh, there's a family member. So there's all of a sudden the whole possible trajectory of the narrative changes when you learn that there's a kinsman, right? So that sets up, where this is going to go in chapter 2. So will someone pick up there and read chapter 2, 1 through 7? Go ahead, Kathy.
And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." The Lord bless you, they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, whose young woman is that? And the foreman replied, she's the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter.
Thanks. So we're familiar with gleaning, right? We do that as a ministry at Good Shepherd. Slightly different in our contemporary context, but in the ancient world, among the Israelites in particular, of course, the commandment was to leave the edges of the field for the stranger, the sojourner, the poor in the land, and so that's what Ruth is doing. I think it's important to note that the initiative once again comes from Ruth. Just like in chapter 1, Ruth is the one that says, I'm going, and she initiates that with Naomi. And here once again, verse 2, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field. So Ruth demonstrates again that faithfulness and initiative. Why isn't Naomi going to work? That was one question that came up earlier and that I was thinking about.
She's old.
You think she's too old?
Yeah, age.
It's a question that commentators raise because we don't know. I mean, if they were in Moab by 10 years, she might be in her 50s, and she, there's lots of stories of women in the Old Testament who are widows and who are older and who are working in fields and going to wells and doing that sorts of things. So it's a question. Why is Ruth the only one going out to work?
Probably the same reason that why didn't Naomi go to her relatives? She's a widow who is obviously poor. They have very or anything to eat, and gleaning is the only way they're going to get their food. But it's strange that Naomi does not take any initiative to her husband, her dead husband's family. I mean, the tradition is there. Someone in his family should be paying off any debt she has and providing food.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to say is, I mean, again, she, as I said last time, she was the one with the resources to get out of town when the factory shut. She's a proud woman, and she's ashamed of her situation.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the first chapter, it said Naomi had said to Ruth to go back to your family because I'm too old to have another husband or have children. So she herself said she was old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other lens to view Naomi at this point is through the lens of grief, right? I mean, chapter 1 ends with, don't call me Naomi, of course, which means pleasant, but call me Mara, which means bitter, So I think another possibility is that she is still deep in her grief as well. But to your point, Paul, I hadn't thought about that either. Where is Elimelech's family? Right. Ruth is going out to find Boaz, but there's been no initiative at this point on the part of Elimelech's family to take care of Naomi, which is interesting.
And the one other thing I was going to say is, I mean, Ruth, I think today we would say she's a woman with gumption, right? And it may be that before it occurred to Naomi that they needed something to live on, that Ruth took that initiative, that she is just always one step ahead of her mother-in-law.
Yeah. No, Ruth is a remarkable character for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we know that the reapers are not Episcopalians, right? Because they got the response wrong. right? The Lord be with you. And, we expect them to say, and also with you, right? Their response isn't bad though. The Lord bless you.
But Doug, that could have been right 0.2.
It could have been, yeah.
It preceded and with thy spirit. I mean,
Right.
we're evolving.
Yeah. They're a liturgical novice here, right? Notice how Ruth is almost always connected. The name Ruth is almost always connected to the word to her ethnic identity, Moabite, or described as a foreigner. As the reader, we're not meant to forget that, right? It's in your face through the whole narrative. Ruth the Moabite, I'm a foreigner. That's part of her character. It's part of her identity, and it's critical to understanding what's happening in the story.
And if you think about it, Doug, her acceptance as we go through is very unusual for the era that this is occurring in. This is a time when the Israelites were a very inclusive life. You were either an Israelite or you were what we today call a barbarian or an outsider.
So they were
And
exclusive.
they were not very welcoming to outsiders.
Well, and as I said, the Moabites in particular were despised because of their origins, as I mentioned, through Lot and the disgrace of that situation. So yeah, absolutely. And again, there could have been other places. And Moab is sort of south. I think it's sort of southeast of Israel proper, the Promised Land. So kind of like with Jonah, they're going down, right? They go down to Moab. So yeah, Ruth the Moabite was that name would have been that ethnic identity would have been very problematic for her.
So do you think she looked different, that she was remarkable, not just in personality and her work ethic, but that maybe she even looked different because she seems to, jump out of the crowd? I mean, Boaz recognizes, oh, there's somebody new there, who is that?
That's a great question. I don't know if ethnically or for any other reason there would have been visual distinction or differences in terms of how she looked. That's a great question.
Might be very pretty. We don't know that.
Yeah, no, we talked about that at 11. I think there's some indications that she probably was
Very attractive.
yeah, very attractive, that people took notice of her. Yeah.
And number,
What we don't know is if in the reading in the chapter, the gleaming is not the gleaming, but the
Glean.
harvest. The harvesting is being done by women. And since at that era, if you were well off, you had a multiple of wives, many wives. And in the story, as it's written, he recognizes her as a stranger, not one of his group of harvesters.
Mm-hmm.
So he has to have a very good idea of who the women are that are doing the harvesting.
Yeah.
And I think they're all wives. And here's a stranger in the midst of his wives.
Yeah. Sherry and then Kathy.
I'm going to number 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor. What is she saying there? Is she trying to find a guy? Or?
Well, she's trying to find Boaz.
Well, she doesn't know of Boaz necessarily. I mean, Boaz is going to discover her.
Well, yeah, I don't know. My reading of that is that there's two things going on at the same time, right? I think there is this initiative of Ruth, and you're right. We don't know that she knows anything about Boaz, but my translation says, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. So my reading is that there's an indication that she knows she's looking for someone, that there's maybe implied that Naomi and Ruth have had a conversation before this. But then the very next verse, so she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. So there's this intention on the part of Ruth and sort of personal agency that she is embodying. And at the same time, there's this kind of very human, she just sort of stumbled upon the field that Boaz was in, which again, I think can be interpreted as divine agency, right? Putting Ruth in the place where she needs to be to meet her Redeemer. And this goes back to our conversation last week. We don't see God's agency clearly articulated the way we see it in Jonah, where God does this and God, caused a big fish to swallow Jonah. There's none of that in Ruth. It's more of this subtle humans act, and then there's sort of this divine action, and it's this dance almost that happens in the book. That's my reading. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, first I wanted to comment that my book says that the steps to this field happens that the men go along with the sickles and cut the standing grain, and then the tying of bundles or sheaves was usually done by women. And so then what was left behind that lays on the ground was for the gleaning. And my thoughts on how she ended up following someone that was acceptable was, have you ever gone to a party and you see this group's a little friendlier than another one? So wouldn't you want to follow the people that kind of smile at you a little bit than the ones that are making faces at you? So that's what I took to mean. But it happened to be Boaz field. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's continue on. Verse 8 through 13. This is really the heart of the chapter here, 8 through 13.
I'll read it.
Okay, Kathy.
Okay. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She explained, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you have noticed me, a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.
One more verse.
Okay. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls.
Yeah. So what strikes me in this passage, I mean, there's so much going on. Obviously, Boaz is responding with great kindness and generosity and mercy. And, we sort of skipped over that he is called a worthy man, a man of honor. And the name Boaz itself means strong and worthy. So we should expect someone who's given that name and then who is specifically given the designation a worthy man, a man of honor, to act with integrity and generosity and kindness. We're sort of set up for that. But I think even the ancient listeners would have looked at Boaz's actions towards this Moabite girl that he's meeting for the first time in his field. Not only is he acting generously, but he becomes her protector, right?
Mhm.
And what struck me as I was reading it this week is this line, given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And in many ways, Boaz is the embodiment of that for her, right? All of this language of you have comforted me and spoken kindly to me. It's this image of almost a mother bird almost brooding over her chicks. And it goes back to verse 16 in chapter 1, where Naomi or Ruth makes the proclamation, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. And here Boaz is confirming that with essentially a blessing, right? May the Lord do these things for you. So it's really remarkable that this Israelite man, who at this point, I don't think they even have made the connection yet about Boaz and Ruth being sort of this potential for the kinsman redeemer. Yeah. I mean, it's implied, but it's not explicit yet in the story. Other takeaways from this first real encounter here between Ruth and Boaz. You also sense affection, don't you? I mean, Boaz is already showing care for her and showing grace in many ways.
Showing fatherly care when he says my daughter, he calls her my daughter.
Mhm.
So, which is, as a term of endearment, but it puts her, say in a father-daughter relationship.
Mhm.
Or maybe that's just how somebody would refer to a young person. I don't know, but it seemed closer to me than just young woman.
Yeah.
There's almost the sense that Boaz is recognizing in Ruth someone whose virtue is equal to his own
Mm-hmm.
in the way he talks to her. And that word refuge is one that comes up a lot in this chapter. And let me just get this right. It is, the word is chasa, that sound, chasa is the word.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, Ian, that she is a woman of virtue equal to his own, because that's exactly right. This phrase worthy man in verse 1 of chapter 2 is the same adjective that Boaz is going to use of Ruth later in the story. So he's going to call Ruth a worthy or a noble woman. And so absolutely, in the course of the narrative, they become sort of these equals in terms of character and ethics and what they embody, for sure. But listen to the abundance of this, right? Moving on to verse 14, and at mealtime. So now you wouldn't expect sort of the master or the one sort of in charge to share a meal with the stranger or the poor or the reapers even. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over, right? These images of abundance. So she rose to glean. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. One translation says the standing stalks. And this goes back to what you were saying, Kathy, that she's not to get just the leftovers anymore, but now she can glean from the proper part of the field where they are harvesting, right? And also pull out from some of the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her, right? So she is basically to take what she wants, right? So this extraordinary generosity towards Ruth on the part of Boaz, and of course it's meant to mirror the faithfulness of Ruth in chapter 1 towards Naomi. And that'll develop as we go along. Yeah, Joe.
Is there any negative in her leaving her parents, her mother and father? She leaves them. Is there a bit of social climbing or something that she then switches over to the Israelites? I mean, is that how unusual is that? Do you leave your parents and take up with strangers? Because what do you think? You're going to have a better life with the strangers than you would back home, so you leave?
Her in-law is not a stranger, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Well, okay.
yeah, right. It's interesting that the extended families don't play a role here, really. That any of the in-laws except for Naomi. Well, that's gonna be an interesting way that the rest of this chapter sort of plays out. Is the names Ruth and Naomi are used less frequently, and their relationships, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, are more explicit, and we can talk about that. But I think it was Linda last week. I'm not sure if Linda's on the call still, but that raised that question last week. What about Ruth's family? Maybe she didn't have much to go back to. Maybe there were other issues going on that really this was her only option to go and follow Naomi. We don't know that from the text. Another reading would be that Ruth is sort of like Abraham, right? Who, under the direction of Yahweh, leaves behind all that she's known and what would be safe and secure, and maybe the easy way to go back to her father's house to go into this new land. So she follows sort of the pattern of the patriarchs in some way. So there's different ways to read that, but it's a great question. Yeah, Debbie.
I think too, the other daughter-in-law also wanted to stay. And I think Naomi must have been quite a woman of great character, because both these young women wanted to stay with her and help her, and did not really want to leave her. And I think maybe because Naomi was depressed, or not dealing with reality as well as she could have. And the fact that she didn't know that there was a Boaz in the future, but that she just wanted to be with her mother-in-law to help her. And also, like you said, her God would be, Ruth would take on her God and her people as a commitment. This was not just, when she married, she really did leave her family and became one with her new family. And as a role model, that's a good thing to do, is to go to Yahweh.
Yeah. Well, and if you're the reader, I mean, if you're the sort of listener to this story, and chapter 2, verse 1 introduces this relative, right? There's a relative of the clan of Elimelech. So now you have in your mind that this person is a possible redeemer. You couldn't ask for a better redeemer, right, than Boaz. I mean, I don't have any concrete examples, but I would imagine that there were plenty of occasions where the redeemer did the bare minimum, right? They might have paid the debt and got the person out or whatever, but it wasn't with the level of care and extravagance and abundance that Boaz demonstrates towards Ruth. And again, that's why I wanted to review verses 1 through 5, because I think we're really meant to get the intensity of the suffering at the beginning of the book that then is contrasted with this abundance and this care that's provided in chapter 2. So will someone pick up in verse 17 and read to the end of the chapter? Sue, do you want to read that for us?
Sherry, you wanted to read, yeah.
Okay, Paul.
Paul got shot in the eye and my eye is blurry. I'm sorry.
I'll read. I'll take over for Paul. How's that? And let's see, I should be beginning at
17.
17. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah, which I understand is 2/3 of a bushel of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women. Otherwise, you might be bothered in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
Great. Thank you so much. So now we get the connection, right? This man, his name is Boaz. Naomi's, probably ecstatic at this point. Boaz is of the clan of my deceased husband. He's well, she doesn't say that exactly, but we know that from verse 1. And it's interesting, the translations, because I've got a couple in front of me, but verse 20, and Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness," and this is the Hebrew word hesed here, which we've talked about before. It's the closest equivalent in Hebrew to the concept of grace, God's steadfast love and faithfulness and kindness, unearned and undeserved, very much like grace is in the New Testament. So may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness, whose hesed, has not forsaken the living or the dead. What's a little bit ambiguous in there is whether that clause is referring to the Lord or to the pronoun he, which would refer to Boaz. And, who's demonstrating hesed here? And I think we talked about that at 11 o'clock, maybe both, right? Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours." Yours said, Sue, one of our nearest relatives.
Nearest kin.
Nearest kin.
Mhm.
Mine says one of our redeemers.
Kinsman redeemer I have.
Yeah, it's the same word in Hebrew. It's the word Gaal in Hebrew. And it means,
Yeah.
at a very basic level, the closest relative, nearest kin. But it came to mean, kinsman redeemer. It came to mean this function of the one who would pay the debt and redeem. So it's interesting, the different translators, whether they decided to go the very literal route and translate it nearest kin, or the more, sort of theological route, if you will, and refer to him as the Redeemer. But other thoughts on this exchange between?
Could I just go back to where you're saying kindness, and you're wondering whose kindness? I mean, is it the Lord's kindness? Is it Boaz's kindness? Right. You said, it could be either. I will tell you, as I read it, I thought it was referring to Boaz, mm-hmm. because of the way the wording is prior to that. Just the verse before, the name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz. And then right away, this is when Naomi says, blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken living. And then she went on to say, the man is so much was on Boaz right there that I felt it was Boaz.
Yeah.
I didn't get a double meaning. I mean, I didn't think of the Lord in this situation.
Well, my Hebrew is not good enough to really parse that out. I don't know if Ian did it this week. And I really don't know how that functions in Hebrew, those kind of dependent clauses and things like that. I don't quite know how that works. But in English, depending on which translation you read, and I think you're absolutely right, Sue, contextually, it seems to refer to Boaz as the one whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead, which could refer to Ruth and all the folks that died, right? That this redemption is going to extend and make good out of what was a very painful time for Naomi and her family. And Boaz becomes their source of hope. But of course, structurally, it could also refer to Yahweh. And Boaz has already embodied the characteristics of Yahweh when she said, you know, when he says, you've come to the Lord to find refuge under his wings. And that's exactly what Boaz is doing. So if the Lord is the one who shows Hesed, then yeah, but Boaz is also showing Hesed because he's sort of the embodiment of that in the story, if that makes sense.
But we've seen before that the Hebrew culture loves such ambiguity. It actually is it's almost like enhancement of the text that you're asking this question.
Absolutely.
What makes you think? No, it does. It does make you think, which is, to me, very important as you're reading this.
Well, and it's almost what we're doing. It's almost like what the rabbis would do, right? They did theology in dialogue, you know, and one would ask a question, and then there'd be a reply with another question, and it just went back and forth. And that's exactly what Ian is saying. So, yeah, Kathy.
Well, this is the NIV Bible I'm using, and in the description underneath, it does refer to it as the Lord, because back in verse 8, Naomi in chapter 1 says, "May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead." So I think she's still talking about the Lord showing kindness here.
Yeah. And that's exactly, so but now Boaz has been introduced to the equation. So it's still the Lord, and you know, now we've got this physical relationship that is also embodying that same Hesed.
But as you read further in, referring to Boaz as the Redeemer at this point doesn't seem right, considering that he is not, in fact, have first rights for declaration. He is not the closest, as we find later in as you read through the chapter. So refer to him at this time as the Redeemer, I think, is incorrect. I think the Redeemer, the thought of Redeemer is in fact God.
Find your thing.
Well, but that's part of the beauty of the story, right? That we don't know that Naomi knows about that other relative, right? It's kind of the, you know, the October surprise for. Sorry.
The chapter 3 surprise. For Halloween.
We're supposed to be reading this. We're supposed to be reading this as if we were hearing, right? I mean, we're reading it, and it's as if somebody was reading this story to us. So we don't know what's coming up. I mean,
right.
Yeah, we do, but supposedly, if we're in that audience of 1 or 100, we don't know that yet.
Yeah, exactly. So if you heard verse 1 of chapter 2, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech named Boaz, and then all of this unfolds. You're kind of cheering now, right?
Because that relative.
Yeah, because now Ruth has come back to Naomi, and she shared all that's happened, and Naomi says, "Oh my goodness, this is Boaz." who is one of our redeemers. And she does say one of our redeemers. So maybe she is aware that there's a potential, and maybe to your point earlier, Paul, no one has stepped forward up to this point. And Boaz is the first one that there's actually now the potential, at least, for him to be their redeemer. Yeah,
Right.
it's absolutely right. I think this is a reading skill that will do you well in any book of the Bible, to try to really suspend as much as possible your own sort of sense of understanding and what you know is about to happen. Because a lot of us, if you've read Genesis before, and to really think through how the narrative is unfolding, because you pick up on these nuances. And again, to the very last verse, so she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. And so much symbolism there. They're in Bethlehem, the house of bread. So now you've got this abundance of grain. And as I said at the start, the barley season was the start of Passover. The wheat season was the indication that the festival of Shavuot, the festival of weeks, Pentecost for us, was to take place. And I think that's part of the brilliance of the narrative. This very human story is being framed by this wonderful historical, theological, and ethical narrative that's happening all around this very human story. Isn't that brilliant? Yeah.
And as I was saying last week, this is very characteristic of the oral tradition, where so much is packed into a story. But going back to verse 1 in chapter 2, verse 1, if this story was told orally, as soon as they say, now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz, I could see Ayenta in the crowd going, aha! I know where this is going.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. May I make a comment? So at the end of last week, we had this discussion about who needs redemption.
Mm-hmm.
And there was some question as to whether that had a negative connotation. So I actually went and looked up the word redemption in my wiki dictionary. And there are 12 definitions. And there are some that could be construed as being negative, like to save from a state of sin or to atone for. But one of the definitions, which I think is meet and right here, is to restore the honor, worth, or reputation of oneself or something. I mean, that's the redemption that I see here.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's what happens for Naomi and Ruth. I mean, Naomi is the matriarch, though. So her story is sort of what weaves the whole story together. Ruth, as the main protagonist, she plays that central role. But it's Naomi, really, that story, I think, that is representative of Israel, right? Israel is in grief. If this is, again, sort of like Jonah, a post-exilic text, they've lost a lot. They're in grief. Their reputation has been soiled. They're in a really bad place, just like Naomi. And through the events of her extended family, there is redemption. And there's so much here that Christians are going to pick up on, right? That through this lineage, then through the extension through the generations, there rises the Redeemer, right? Who will do this not just for particular people, but for all of creation, right? This restoration. So what happens in this sort of relatively, in this kind of particular way, in the story it's very particular, but then even within the story of Israel, this particular story of redemption then becomes the story for the whole world, through Christ. So where do you see grace in this chapter?
Everywhere.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
What?
Certainly,
Any-
certainly Ruth receives grace.
Mhm.
And yet the way she has treated her mother-in-law, she deserves to be regarded well. And I know grace is supposed to come to you if like that you didn't necessarily work for it, but I think it does come to her.
Yeah, yeah. Although her status as a Moabite really would have negated in many cases her character, no matter what her sort of moral character was, her ethnic identity would have negated much of that in the eyes of most, I think, ancient Israelites. So the response of Boaz to see through, sort of like the famous line when Samuel's going to anoint David, God doesn't look at the exterior, the outside of a person, but looks at the heart, right? And I think that applies here as well, that Boaz doesn't see her as a Moabite, whether she looked different. I forget who brought that up. What her status was in terms of her identity as a foreigner, but shows tremendous generosity and grace to her. But yeah, even Boaz does say, though, the Lord repay you for what you have done. I mean, he acknowledges her faithfulness there. But if Naomi's grieving, then Ruth is showing grace, tremendous grace to Naomi, right? That she's there with her and allowing her to grieve and stay home, we think, while Ruth goes out and pursues a redeemer. Right? So.
In 21, it says, Ruth says, he even said to me, just amazing. He even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful grace that he's giving.
Yeah, she knew he was doing something above and beyond, out of the ordinary custom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sort of a reckless generosity.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So
good.
why would Naomi not be the one who should be redeemed?
Well, I think Naomi very much is the one who is redeemed. Yeah.
No, I mean she is by Ruth and becomes, it all ends up fine, but she's the widow of the relative, not Ruth.
Right.
They both are.
Well, they both are.
They both are. Yeah.
Yeah, they both have lost Israelite husbands.
Yeah, Ruth's husband.
Yeah. And so,
Okay, because the son was also, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And we're jumping forward, but towards the very end, the writer makes it clear that Naomi is the one.
Yes.
who is
Yeah.
coming and the women of the neighborhood said, a son has been born to Naomi, even though
Yes, yeah, it goes back to
Yeah.
restored her dignity.
Yeah.
But which again leads you to an interesting aspect, and I haven't. When you think about the outcome and historically what it isn't Naomi that's the main character in this story in Jewish tradition as they practice their religion. It is Ruth who is held in high esteem. It isn't Naomi, even though in this story they attribute the child to Naomi, but it truly, historically, the important character in the Jewish tradition and who's held in esteem is Ruth. She is.
Yes. Yes and no. Yeah. I mean, in terms of her example, Ruth is the one who is lifted up as the example of faithfulness and obedience. I think in terms of who embodies Israel in the story, I think it's Naomi. I think Naomi embodies Israel just the way Jonah embodied Israel in a very different way. But Naomi is the one who has been cut off and But so we'll pick up that as we look at chapters 3 and 4. But I can't tell you, I couldn't be more pleased with how this whole study has gone, because I wasn't sure how these 3 books were going to fit together. But it's really been wonderful to pick up these different themes in all of the books and connect them across testaments and everything. It's been wonderful. So thank you all for your faithful reading and what you bring every week. It's really wonderful. So I learn something every week, which is great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Good.
So tonight at 7 o'clock, I really want to encourage you, Faith and Politics for 1 hour. You can do it. We can all do it for 1 hour. And I've got a couple of videos that I'm going to show tonight. One from our presiding bishop from a few years ago, and have some discussion in response to those videos. So I hope you'll pop on. The link is on Prayer and Study for that at 7 o'clock tonight. So
We might run over.
what's that?
We might run over tonight.
Bring
Yeah.
something heavier to drink than tea.
You know. All right. See you all later, or see you next week. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
I know.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.